What if the Cold War had turned hot? The battle for the Atlantic. If the Cold War had escalated into a full-scale conflict, one of the most critical questions would be, who would have dominated the Atlantic Ocean? Despite the Soviet Union's vast arsenal of ships and aircraft during the 1970s, the Soviet Navy remained significantly weaker compared to the combined naval power of NATO, particularly the United States and its Western allies. Throughout the decades of the Cold War, the military balance between the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and the Soviet Union underwent continuous shifts. A hypothetical U.S. Soviet war would have unfolded differently depending on the time period and the specific global theater of battle, whether in Central Europe, the Arctic, the North Atlantic, the Pacific Far East, or even in space. While most changes in military capabilities evolved gradually, certain technological leaps and strategic innovations dramatically altered the balance of power. In analyzing Cold War alternate history scenarios, it is essential to examine how each major theater of conflict might have been contested. Nowhere was this more important than at sea, where NATO's ability to maintain open Atlantic supply lines was crucial for sustaining its war effort in Europe. During the late 1970s, particularly under President Jimmy Carter's administration, the naval balance tilted strongly toward NATO. If war had erupted during this period, the Soviet Navy would have faced overwhelming challenges. While capable of mounting significant submarine and surface operations, the Soviets lacked the ability to decisively cut off NATO's Atlantic lifelines or achieve maritime superiority. Refighting the Battle of the Atlantic. What if the Cold War had turned hot? In any Cold War alternate history scenario where tensions between the superpowers erupted into open conflict, the Atlantic Ocean would have become a decisive theater of war. The U.S. Navy, USN, long anticipated that the Soviet Navy's strategy in a hypothetical U.S. Soviet war would mirror the German approach in both world wars, launching a relentless submarine campaign to sever the vital transatlantic supply routes connecting North America to NATO forces in Europe. A key battleground in this fight would have been the JUK Gap, the narrow maritime choke point between Greenland, Iceland, and the United Kingdom. Soviet submarines, both nuclear and diesel-electric, were expected to attempt penetration through this region to target NATO shipping lanes, threaten nuclear missile submarines, SSBNs, and harass U.S. carrier battle groups. While the Soviet Navy possessed an impressive fleet of submarines, NATO maintained a clear strategic edge. NATO's air superiority over the JUK Gap, combined with a sophisticated network of anti-submarine warfare (ASW) assets, including advanced surface vessels and its own formidable submarine fleet, gave it the tools needed to win what some analysts call a potential third battle of the Atlantic. By the late 1960s, Soviet ballistic missile submarines lacked the range of their NATO counterparts, forcing them to transit dangerous waters where they would be highly vulnerable to detection and destruction. The Soviet surface fleet, though significantly expanded since World War II, would have played only a limited and defensive role in this scenario. Its primary objective would have been survival, avoiding annihilation by U.S. carrier strike groups and NATO submarines rather than attempting to seize control of the Atlantic. Geography was another major disadvantage for the Soviets. Their naval forces were divided into 4 separate fleets: Northern, Baltic, Black Sea, and Pacific, that were largely incapable of mutual support, with only the Northern Fleet realistically positioned to challenge NATO in the Atlantic. Bastions, the Soviet Navy's Arctic stronghold. By the 1970s, the Soviet Navy had shifted its strategic priorities toward a doctrine known as the Bastion strategy. This approach aimed to defend the patrol zones of Soviet nuclear ballistic missile submarines, SSBNs, against NATO incursions. The strategy emerged from a critical vulnerability. Early Soviet SSBNs lacked the range to strike U.S. targets without traversing the perilous JUK Gap, where NATO's anti-submarine warfare, ASW, dominance posed a severe threat. The introduction of the Project 667B Delta-class submarines in 1972 marked a turning point. These new SSBNs could launch strategic nuclear strikes from protected waters closer to Soviet territory, eliminating the need for risky deployments into the Atlantic. Consequently, Soviet naval doctrine pivoted to fortifying Arctic patrol zones, particularly in the Barents Sea, with layered defenses to prevent NATO's submarines and surface vessels from penetrating these bastions. NATO's response and the Soviet ASW expansion. NATO initially underestimated the implications of this strategic shift. Although some analysts raised alarms in the late 1960s, the alliance was slow to adapt. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union poured resources into anti-submarine warfare platforms designed to protect these bastions. The Moskva-class helicopter cruisers, Moskva and Leningrad, epitomized this defensive mindset. While lacking robust surface or air defense capabilities, they deployed an impressive array of ASW helicopters capable of hunting NATO submarines when operating as part of a larger task force. Throughout the 1970s, the Soviet Navy expanded its ASW fleet with a series of specialized warships. The Kinda and Kresta I-class cruisers, originally optimized for surface warfare, were replaced by the Kresta II and Kara-class cruisers, both purpose-built for submarine hunting. In addition, Kashin-class air defense destroyers bolstered the Soviet fleet, supplementing the older gun and missile destroyers of the early Cold War. The Krivat-class frigates, the first of which entered service in the 1970s, added another layer to the Soviet ASW shield. The arrival of Kiev. The launch of Kiev, the Soviet Union's first heavy aircraft-carrying cruiser, marked another milestone. Commissioned into the Northern Fleet in 1976, Kiev featured Yak-38 Forger V/STOL fighters alongside a complement of ASW helicopters. Designed as the centerpiece of a bastion defense task force, Kiev could deter NATO surface ships, counter maritime patrol aircraft, and actively hunt enemy submarines. This combination of advanced surface vessels, helicopter carriers, and SSBM protecting infrastructure underscored the Soviet Navy's transformation. By the late 1970s, Moscow's strategy was less about projecting power across the Atlantic and more about denying NATO access to its Arctic strongholds. Other missions, Soviet naval offensives, and regional strategies. In any Cold War alternate history scenario, the Soviet Navy's responsibilities would not have been limited to protecting its SSBN bastions. Moscow's naval planners were equally concerned about the threat posed by U.S. carrier battle groups, which could launch devastating strikes against Soviet ports, military installations, and industrial centers. For close-in defense, the Soviets relied on large numbers of Komar-class and OSA-class missile-armed patrol boats, as well as an extensive fleet of diesel-electric submarines. These smaller, fast-attack platforms were designed to operate near Soviet coastlines, providing a defensive shield against carrier incursions. Supporting this strategy was the Soviet Naval Air Fleet, which deployed heavy bombers capable of long-range strike missions. By the late 1970s, the Soviets had a formidable array of naval aviation assets, including Tu-16 Badger and Tu-95 Bear long-range aircraft, used primarily for reconnaissance and anti-submarine warfare, and the powerful Tu-22M backfire bombers. The backfire was particularly threatening due to its ability to carry long-range air-launched cruise missiles, LCMs, designed to overwhelm U.S. carrier defenses. Soviet doctrine envisioned large, coordinated attacks by these bombers to saturate U.S. carrier battle groups, hoping to avoid interception by F-14 Tomcats and the U.S. Navy's layered air defense network. Regional naval operations. The Soviet Navy's other fleets would also have played crucial roles in regional conflicts. The Black Sea Fleet, with access to strong air support and close logistical bases, the Soviet Navy could have launched strikes along Turkey's long, exposed coastline. While outright removal of Turkey from the conflict would have been unlikely, harassment and attrition campaigns might have aimed to disrupt NATO's southern flank. The Baltic Fleet. This fleet would have concentrated on choking Denmark's narrow straits and targeting southern Norway, directly threatening NATO's access to the Baltic Sea and northern Europe. The Mediterranean 5th Operational Squadron operating far from home waters. This unit could have harassed NATO's southern allies, including Italy and France. However, With U.S. support and NATO naval superiority in the Mediterranean, Soviet influence here would likely have been limited to harassment and diversionary operations. Soviet presence in the Pacific. In the Pacific theater, the Soviet Union maintained sufficient naval and air assets to protect SSBN bastions near the Kamchatka Peninsula and the Sea of Okhotsk. At the same time, they could threaten Japan, South Korea, or U.S. Pacific bases, such as Guam. Despite these regional threats, the Soviet Navy faced an overwhelming global disadvantage at sea. While some Soviet submarines would have undoubtedly risked the dangerous passage through the GUK Gap to harass NATO, shipping, and test U.S. Navy defenses, the overall maritime balance heavily favored the United States and its NATO allies. Conclusion: who would have ruled the seas if the Cold War turned hot? Despite its large fleet of ships, submarines, and aircraft, the Soviet Navy of the 1970s was still decisively outmatched by the combined naval forces of NATO. The ultimate fate of the Soviet fleet would have depended heavily on the duration of a potential land war in Central Europe. The longer the Red Army struggled to achieve a breakthrough on land, the greater the attrition the Soviet Navy would have suffered, even while operating near its own bases and under the protection of its bastion strategy. As the 1970s gave way to the 1980s, Soviet naval power continued to expand and modernize. However, the United States Navy simultaneously developed increasingly aggressive strategies, including direct attacks on Soviet SSBN patrol zones and potential strikes deep into Soviet territory. In a Cold War alternate history where conflict turned hot, NATO's superior maritime coordination, advanced carrier strike groups, and global reach would likely have sealed the fate of the Soviet fleet. What's next? The Cold War remains one of history's greatest what-if scenarios. Exploring U.S. Soviet war strategies helps us understand just how close the world came to an all-out confrontation between two superpowers. If you enjoyed this deep dive into what if the Cold War had turned hot, subscribe to History Love for more gripping alternate history scenarios, untold battles, and detailed historical analysis. What do you think? Could the Soviet Navy have turned the tide in a global conflict? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like the video for more high-quality history content.